situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Hans Grunberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Ms. Edem Wosernu, Director of Operations and Advocacy, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grunberg.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, allow me to state the obvious. We meet at a particularly challenging time for Yemen and for the region. Until recently, we were making steady progress in our mediation, and for almost 2 years, relative calm has prevailed along the front lines, and key actors continued negotiations toward ending the conflict in Yemen. In late December 2023, the parties committed to me to a nationwide ceasefire, measures to improve living conditions, and restarting an intra-Yemeni political process. They also committed to work with my office to operationalize these commitments through a UN roadmap agreement. I am grateful for the roles of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman in supporting the UN mediation. However, the locus of attention has since shifted. The mediation landscape is now undeniably much more complex, and efforts to reach an agreement are being buffeted by different priorities and interests. Rising regional tensions linked to the war in Gaza, and in particular the military escalation in the Red Sea, are slowing down the pace of the peace efforts in Yemen. As much as I have tried to insulate the peace process from wider regional dynamics, the reality is that mediation efforts in Yemen cannot be neatly cordoned off. What happens regionally impacts Yemen, and what happens in Yemen can impact the region. In response to Ansar Allah's repeated attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, the United States and the United Kingdom have struck weapons storage facilities, missile systems, and other targets in Ansar Allah-controlled areas in Yemen. And in the coming days, also in response to Ansar Allah's military actions in the Red Sea, the United States is expected to designate Ansar Allah a specially designated terrorist group. Let me be frank, these developments are concerning. Despite potential complications, my work will continue no matter what. It is therefore imperative that we protect the political space, that communication channels are kept open, and that all actors remain actively engaged with my efforts. While the spotlight is on the Red Sea, I also want to draw your attention to worrying developments inside Yemen. There is a sense of foreboding along several front lines, with reports of clashes, mobilizations, and casualties, including in Shabwa, Al-Jawf, Ma'arib, Sada, and Taiz. I'm also concerned about the growing din of public threats to return to fighting. Meanwhile, the scale of economic challenges across the country is simply staggering. Civil servants, especially in Ansar Allah-controlled areas, have not been paid their salaries in full, and people in government-controlled areas face extended power outages and rising prices as a result of currency depreciation. In the past week, I have visited Aden, Mocha, and Taiz. I have listened to Yemeni's concerns, particularly those related to the need to open roads and improve living conditions, and I have heard their hopes for the future. I have also consistently signaled the importance of maintaining calm on the front lines and protecting progress made so far. Madam President, although the path to peace now faces more challenges, my mediation approach is flexible enough to adapt to different scenarios and challenges. In addition to Yemen, I have traveled extensively in the region in the past weeks, including to Iran, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. My discussions have focused on the need for a conducive environment for resolving the conflict in Yemen. Amid today's shifting sands, I see that three things need to happen in the immediate term to create an off-ramp to this dangerous escalatory cycle. First, we need to see regional de-escalation. The United Nations is engaging with relevant stakeholders to encourage the prioritization of diplomatic channels to this end. The United Nations Secretary General has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and has warned he is gravely concerned about the further spillover of this conflict. I reiterate his call, and I am engaging the Yemeni parties and relevant regional actors to support de-escalation in the Red Sea to protect the mediation space in Yemen. Second, the Yemeni parties must stop public provocations and refrain from military opportunism inside Yemen at this delicate juncture. Escalation in Yemen is a choice. Making that choice comes with a price that will be paid by the Yemenis in even greater loss of lives and livelihoods. The parties must avoid all actions that risk this outcome. And I am encouraged, Madam President, that in my latest exchanges, I have received assurances that all parties prefer the path to peace. Third, and because Yemen is not a footnote to a wider regional story, the parties need to refocus on safeguarding the progress that has been made thus far toward reaching an agreement. The regional escalation does not negate the urgent needs in Yemen for a nationwide ceasefire, paying public sector salaries, resuming oil exports, opening roads, ports, and airports, reconstruction, and other elements that have been under negotiation. The parties still need to engage in sustainable dialogue structures under UN auspices to achieve these measures and address other priorities. My office has been engaging the parties on the details of a ceasefire mechanism that would bring them together, building off the military coordination committee established during the truce. And we continue to prepare for the creation of a joint economic committee facilitated by the United Nations to support the implementation of agreed economic measures and to negotiate other short and long-term priorities. Ultimately, peace is a political project, so the backbone of all of this must be a credible, internationally supported, intra-Yemeni political process. Through this process, Yemenis will decide how durably end the war and to build a new political future. Madam President, there is no reason Yemenis should be condemned to conditions of war, poverty, and repression. The United Nations roadmap under discussion presents an alternative future. Instead of the zero-sum mindset of war and extraction, the parties can cooperate to generate transformative benefits for all Yemenis. For example, a durable nationwide ceasefire would save lives and allow for the revival of economic life. Opening roads and removing double taxation would enhance civilian safety and lower prices of essential goods. Resuming oil and gas production and export would generate significant finance flows, enabling civil servant salary payments and public service delivery. All of this would mean Yemenis have a better access to health, education, and other essential needs and services. In peacetime, international donors could support rebuilding houses and infrastructure and developing sectors such as renewable energy developing sectors such as renewable energy. Foreign direct investment could help Yemen move from aid dependency to investment-driven post-conflict reconstruction. Yemen would have greater access to grants and lending from international financial institutions. More internally displaced persons could return home. And crucially, a political settlement should ensure that Yemenis can participate safely and freely in civil and political life. It should also ensure state institutions are accountable to the priorities and needs of Yemenis. Madam President, Yemenis deserve nothing less. We've seen successful peace processes in other contexts unlock many of these gains. And in Yemen, there is a compelling alternative to the path of conflict and economic ruin. We are working toward an agreement that allows the parties to come together, negotiate political, economic, and military security priorities, and make a difference to the lives of the Yemeni people. This is a pathway to shared and common recovery. Everyone in this council wields influence. What you say and what you do matters, and Yemen deserves your full attention. Although your vantage points vary, you have a collective responsibility to protect the mediation space and ensure Yemenis have a real chance at peace. I will continue to rely on your concerted support. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Wasernu.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Hans for his update. Whilst Yemen's terrible conflict and associated human suffering has dragged on for over 9 years, we must maintain hope for a political solution. However, people in Yemen are watching with alarm as a crisis spreading across the region brings with it the risk of renewed violence. This is a cause for concern for the people in Yemen and the humanitarian community serving them. In these uncertain times, we are thankful that Julian Hernis has assumed his new role as the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Yemen. He has Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths' full support in fulfilling his essential duties. Further, of course, allow me to thank Peter Hawkins of UNICEF for serving as the resident and humanitarian coordinator ad interim, as well as indeed the previous resident and humanitarian coordinator, David Gressy, for all his work. Madam President, members of the Council, last year, some progress was made in mitigating the humanitarian situation, an indication of the positive impacts of the UN-brokered truce, the subsequent cessation of hostilities, and the humanitarian response. However, the humanitarian appeal for 2024, we and our partners released 2 weeks ago, paints a picture of massive continuing humanitarian needs. For example, in 2024, over 18 million people, that is over half the population of Yemen, will need humanitarian assistance and protection in Yemen, protection services. We anticipate that 17.6 million people will be severely food insecure. An estimated 2.7 million women and children, 5 million children under 5 will need treatment for acute malnutrition. The situation will unfortunately continue to deteriorate without urgent and sufficient attention. Madam President, in 2023, we received just 40% of the total funding needed under the humanitarian plan. We received 1.72 billion of the 4.3 billion US dollars requested. We are truly grateful for donor support and the contributions to the humanitarian response and indeed for the people of Yemen. This year, our response is more targeted and even more prioritized. Our plan has been informed by area-based consultations with local authorities, humanitarian and development actors, and most importantly, the people we serve, the affected people of Yemen. It is better aligned also to some of the development efforts underway. As a result, this year's humanitarian appeal requires 2.7 billion to reach 11.2 million people across Yemen. We've gone down from 4.3 billion ask to $2.7 billion. As a matter of priority, we urge the international community to augment its efforts to ensure that the World Food Programme and its partners have the resources necessary to urgently resume food distribution in Houthi-controlled areas and initiate a retargeted and registration exercise. Without sufficient resources, we may see a sharp deterioration of the food security situation in some areas in the coming months. 2.4 million children and 900,000 women will face an elevated risk of morbidity and mortality due to the malnutrition-related complications. Additionally, in parallel, fully funding the United Nations Development Framework, estimated at 1.3 billion US dollars, should be a priority to see a transition towards more sustainable solutions. Madam President, as we briefed last month, we are watching closely to assess the impact of the hostilities in the Red Sea on the humanitarian situation and on our humanitarian operations. We are receiving reports that transport costs to Hodeidah and Aden ports have significantly increased since November due to the ongoing hostilities. The World Food Programme has reported increases of up to 110% for containerized shipments to Yemen. Other humanitarian organizations have seen freight rate increase of up to 318%. While the humanitarian community is also concerned about any potential adverse effects of the recent designation of the Houthis as a specially designated global terrorist, we note that general licenses are designed to safeguard many transactions necessary for our humanitarian activities and essential commercial imports. Nevertheless, we fear there may be an effect, of course, on the economy, including commercial imports of essential items on which the people of Yemen, depend on more than ever. Humanitarian aid cannot make up for the gaps in the supply of commercial goods. Such effects may reverberate across the country. Yemen's already fragile economic state cannot handle any further major shocks. In government-held areas, the value of the Yemen rial has deteriorated even further, reaching its lowest point in over 2 years at 1,514 rials against the dollar, eroding more than ever the purchasing power of the average family. We welcome the 30-day delay in implementing the designation, which has enabled consultations within the humanitarian community and the private sector to mitigate its potential impacts. More broadly, humanitarian organizations are putting in place business continuity plans and engaging with a broad set of actors on the ground to, of course, minimize the impact of regional tensions on the humanitarian response and on the people of Yemen. I echo the United Nations Secretary General's call for Security Council Resolution 2722 to be respected in its entirety and the need to avoid acts that could further worsen the situation in Yemen. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, as the possibility of a return to conflict and increased humanitarian needs grow, we must remember that Yemen is at the forefront of yet another crisis, the global climate crisis. It is the third most vulnerable country in the world to climate change and one of the least prepared for climate shocks. By 2060, the United Nations Development Programme predicts that extreme poverty could be more than 25% higher than it otherwise would be due to climate change. Climate-induced natural hazards are also already worsening the impacts of the annual rainy season, droughts, water scarcity, and desert locusts. Last year, heavy rains and flooding affected around 580,000 people and caused a reported 2,381 injuries and 47 deaths. Climate-related emergencies not only compound pre-existing risks, but also drive new needs. Over 3/4 of the people newly displaced in Yemen last year were displaced because of severe weather events. Climate change emergencies accelerate the humanitarian crisis by driving displacement and increasing protection concerns. They threaten the lives and livelihoods and well-being of households. The impact on girls and women who have more limited access to essential services and protection services can be particularly severe. However, Yemen will need much more international support to prepare for and mitigate the worst impact of the climate crisis. This includes adequate access to climate financing, assistance with streamlining national preparatory systems, and investment in climate resilient development activities and initiatives. Madam President, let me end with 3 points. 2024 can still be the year Yemen turns the page on the tragedy and suffering stemming from years of conflict and economic deterioration. Second, we urge the Council to offer its full support to the humanitarian community in its ability to respond to the urgent crisis being experienced, help the people of Yemen transition towards self-sufficiency. And lastly, we further ask Council members to urge all involved to choose the path of de-escalation and peace. I thank you.
Ms. Wissarnu for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me start by thanking Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Wissarnu for their timely briefings. We are very grateful to the Special Envoy for his timely visit to Yemen, including Aden and other cities, and also to other areas in the region. And we're cautiously encouraged to hear the support of parties for peace and very much welcome the flexibility set out in your approach. We therefore encourage the Council to continue to provide unwavering support to the UN Special Envoy during this process. We should work together to safeguard the gains that have been made and support further progress. And we emphasize the importance of the Yemeni parties continuing to engage constructively with the UN. As Hans said, the Yemeni people deserve nothing less than recovery and sustainable peace in Yemen. There is no military solution to this conflict. As Director Wissarnu set out, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating and the needs for this year remain high, with 18.2 million people in need of assistance and with women and girls especially vulnerable. Yemen continues to be one of the most food insecure countries in the world. As we heard, the UN Humanitarian Response Plan for 2024 is a stark reminder of the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen. The plan aims to reach 11.2 million Yemenis most in need. The UK has committed over $110 million in humanitarian aid during this financial year, and we echo Director Wissarnu's call to the international community to consider providing further funding towards the humanitarian response plan for Yemen. President, despite repeated calls to de-escalate, the Houthis have continued illegal and destabilizing attacks in the Red Sea, disrupting maritime shipping and freedom of navigation in the region, and risking further regional escalation. The disruption to shipping in the Red Sea caused by Houthi attacks are, as we heard from Director Wissarnu, driving up the costs of global shipping, including the costs of food supplies and humanitarian aid in the region. And these illegal and unjustified attacks risk exacerbating the humanitarian suffering in Yemen. And that is why we've taken necessary, proportionate, and legal action in self-defense alongside the United States, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, and New Zealand against targets tied to the Houthi attacks. In closing, President, let me underscore our commitment to the peace process in Yemen and to the Special Envoy's personal efforts to bring sustainable peace to the people of Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. On the outset, I also would like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and the Director of Operations and Advocacy Division of OCHA, Adam Wissarnu, for their informative briefings. More than 1 month has now passed since this Council adopted Resolution 2722. Through this resolution, this Council strongly condemned attacks by the Houthis on commercial vessels and demanded an immediate halt to all such attacks. The Republic of Korea feels strongly in its positions that free navigation must be ensured in any case. Thus, we are greatly concerned by the threats and attacks against commercial vessels on the Red Sea by the Houthis. However, despite the consistent message of the international community, the Houthis have repeatedly committed attacks on commercial vessels, including the dangerous missile attacks on 2 ships just last week. These attacks are unacceptable and unjustifiable, regardless of any excuses. Resolution 2722 clearly notes the right of member states, in accordance with international law, to defend their vessels from attacks, including those that undermine navigational rights and freedoms. The Republic of Korea strongly urges the Houthis once again to stop any dangerous provocations. Madam President, the Yemeni people have faced acute sufferings over the last decades due to the seemingly never-ending conflict in the country. It is worrisome that, according to the Humanitarian Response Plan 2024, 18.2 million Yemenis, more than half of the entire population, are still in need of humanitarian assistance. It is also concerning that food insecurity and the adverse effects of climate changes are worsening the already dire humanitarian situation. Rather than further destabilizing the region through its groundless attacks in the Red Sea, the Houthis should instead focus on the ongoing struggles of the Yemeni people by cooperating with relevant parties, including the UN and other international organizations, to establish sustainable peace and development in Yemen. The Houthis must also heed the international calls for an improvement in the human rights situation in northern Yemen. My delegation firmly supports the current efforts by Special Envoy Grundberg to illuminate a brighter future in Yemen, despite this extremely difficult situation. In this connection, we believe that a permanent ceasefire in Yemen and the resumption of the Yemeni-led political process are essential, with a view towards ending the suffering of the Yemeni people. Thus, any military attempts inside Yemen should immediately cease, and meaningful engagement between the parties should resume. As such, the Republic of Korea fully supports a Yemeni-led political transition process with inclusive participation, including all of the previously marginalized groups such as women and youth. We also support the ongoing engagement by key regional countries, including Saudi Arabia and Oman, towards the realization of final agreements. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie Hans Grunberg ainsi que Edem Wassernouk de leur présentation et je salue la présence parmi nous du représentant du Yémen. Madame la Présidente, les Houthis doivent cesser leur action de déstabilisation en mer Rouge. La France renouvelle sa condamnation des attaques menées par les Houthis en mer Rouge et dans le golfe d'Aden contre des navires commerciaux, attaques qui se poursuivent, comme indiqué dans le rapport du secrétaire général à ce sujet. Par ces actions armées, les Houthis portent l'entière responsabilité de l'escalade et nous appelons les Houthis à y mettre fin, à libérer immédiatement le Galaxy Leader et son équipage qui sont otages des Houthis depuis le 19 novembre 2023. La résolution 2722, adoptée par le Conseil de sécurité le 10 janvier dernier, rappelle que l'exercice des droits et libertés de navigation doit être respecté et que les États ont, en accord avec le droit international, le droit de défendre leurs navires contre les attaques. Elle doit être pleinement respectée et appliquée. La France continuera à assumer ses responsabilités et à contribuer à la sûreté maritime dans cette zone, en lien avec ses partenaires de la région, afin de prévenir toute escalade. Et nous déployons déjà des moyens militaires sous mandat national. Nous nous félicitons du lancement prochain de l'opération européenne Aspides en mer Rouge, qui constitue une contribution à la sûreté maritime dans la région. Madame la Présidente, les graves violations du droit international commises par les Houthis en mer Rouge ne doivent pas détourner l'attention de la situation à l'intérieur du Yémen. Face à la montée des tensions dans certains gouvernorats, il faut transformer la trêve partielle et ponctuée d'incidents en cessation des hostilités complètes et durables. Un cessez-le-feu durable permettra d'améliorer la situation humanitaire. Alors que près de la moitié de la population se trouve en situation d'insécurité alimentaire, la réponse humanitaire ne doit pas pâtir des conséquences concrètes des tensions en mer Rouge. La population yéménite, et notamment dans les zones qui sont contrôlées par les Houthis, est la première victime des tensions en mer Rouge, alors que les organisations humanitaires font le constat d'un renchérissement des coûts. Les Houthis continuent également d'entraver l'accès humanitaire des partenaires sur le terrain, et leur responsabilité dans la dégradation de la situation humanitaire est claire. Il faut préserver l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire jusqu'aux populations civiles du Yémen à un coût raisonnable. La France soutient les mécanismes onusiens qui agissent en faveur d'une plus grande stabilité et sécurité au Yémen, à l'image d'UNVIM qui lutte avec efficacité contre les trafics d'armes en mer Rouge. Il doit être renforcé et mieux financé. La France réitère enfin son plein soutien à l'envoyé spécial, à ses efforts inlassables pour définir une feuille de route inclusive. Le processus de paix a été perturbé par le comportement irresponsable des Houthis en mer Rouge, mais il a vocation à se poursuivre selon la feuille de route définie par l'envoyé spécial. La France salue ces efforts et la mobilisation à ce sujet de l'Arabie saoudite, d'Oman et ainsi que d'autres acteurs régionaux. Le Conseil de sécurité doit poursuivre sa mobilisation pour parvenir à un plan de paix. Il s'agit de la seule voie vers une solution politique, globale, inclusive, prenant en compte l'ensemble des préoccupations et les intérêts de tous les Yéménites. La participation pleine, égale, substantielle, effective des femmes yéménites aux négociations politiques doit également être garantie. La France appelle les partis et en premier lieu les Houthis à agir de façon responsable pour parvenir à un accord politique avec le nouveau Premier ministre yéménite dont nous saluons la nomination. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席女士。主席女士，我首先感谢 Groundberg 特使和莫绍努女士刚才所做的通报。我也欢迎也门常驻代表出席今天的会议。一段时间以来，有关各方就政治解决也门问题保持密切沟通，为结束也门人民的苦难做出积极努力，也门政治进程一度取得积极进展。中方对格伦德伯格特使、也门各方以及有关地区国家所做的努力表示赞赏。但令人担忧的是，近期红海局势不断升级，特别是有关国家对也门采取军事行动，加剧红海水域安全风险，同时严重冲击也门政治进程。我们呼吁胡塞武装停止对商船的袭击。我们同时强调，安理会从未授权任何国家对也门使用武力，任何国家不得曲解、滥用国际法和安理会决议，在红海水域制造新的紧张局势。在当前的关键时刻，我们希望也门各方以人民利益为重，展现决断，排除干扰，坚定推进政治进程，取得最终成果。中方支持以也人主导、也人所有原则推进政治进程，支持格伦德伯格特使继续积极开展工作，期待对也门局势有重要影响力的国家继续发挥建设性作用。也门依然是全球人道危机最严重的国家之一，当前民众对粮食、饮用水、医疗等基本需求十分迫切。中方高度关注也门的脆弱人道局势，呼吁国际社会加大对也门的人道和发展投入， 切实帮助改善当地人道状况。主席女士，也门问题的政治解决同地区环境密切相关。当前加沙冲突外溢，红海局势升级，中东地区已经处于极度危险的边缘。摆在各方面前最紧迫的任务是立即推动实现加沙的停火，采取切实有效负责任的行动，防止冲突进一步向地区蔓延。相关国家尤其应该倾听国际社会，特别是地区国家和人民的强烈呼声，停止阻挠安理会采取行动，切实加入到推动加沙早日停火的努力中来。中方愿同国际社会一道，继续为政治解决也门问题、维护中东和平稳定做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Признательный спецпосланнику генсекретаря по Йемену Хансу Грундбергу и директору КГБ по операциям Эдем Вассорну за доклады о политической и гуманитарной обстановке в этой стране. Мы могли бы, разумеется, сегодня в своем выступлении сосредоточиться, как и прежде, на внутриеменской повестке, перспективах урегулирования и итогах переговоров. Но, к сожалению, эти процессы осложнились новым деструктивным фактором, который невозможно игнорировать, а именно продолжающейся агрессии так называемой коалиции во главе с Соединенными Штатами и Великобританией при участии ряда их сателлитов в отношении суверенного Йемена. Начавшиеся 11 января массированные удары по территории этой ближневосточной страны продолжаются по сей день. Такие действия западных стран являются прямым нарушением международного права. Статья 51 Устава ООН, на которой они ссылаются, неприменима к ситуации с коммерческими судами. Право на самооборону не может задействоваться для обеспечения свободы судоходства, тем более, когда речь якобы идет о защите судов, следующих под флагом третьих стран. При этом никакой санкции Совета Безопасности ООН по главе 7 Устава на применение силы тоже не было. Недопустимо и извращенное толкование резолюции Совета Безопасности 2722, которая не дает никакого благословения на силовые действия в Йемене. Такой опасный подход, который Запад практикует все чаще, подрывает авторитет Совета Безопасности и всей Организации Объединенных Наций, ведет к разрушению всей архитектуры безопасности в глобальном масштабе. С сожалением констатируем, что Европейский Союз решил пойти по этому же порочному пути вслед за американцами и объявил о собственной так называемой оборонительной операции «Аспидес», которая, по заявлениям Брюсселя, начнет действовать уже 19 февраля, то есть со следующей недели. Хочу подчеркнуть, что Россия категорически осуждает нападения и перехваты коммерческих судов, а также любые шаги, препятствующие свободе мореплавания. Мы транслируем соответствующие сигналы руководству движения Ансар Аллах, побуждая их сосредоточиться на внутриеменской повестке и финализации соответствующих договоренностей. Однако сомнительные западные авантюры создают для внутриеменского процесса дополнительные риски, отнюдь не делая при этом судоходство в упомянутых акваториях более безопасным. Наоборот, деструктивные шаги Запада только способствуют дальнейшему расползанию хаоса в регионе. Излишне говорить, что незаконные атаки по Йемену негативно сказываются на и без того сложной гуманитарной ситуации в стране, где по-прежнему наблюдается острая нехватка продовольствия и медикаментов. По оценкам ООН, из запрошенных в 2023 году 4,3 миллиардов долларов США на поддержку нуждающихся йеменцев удалось аккумулировать лишь 39%. Если наши американские и британские коллеги действительно хотят помочь, им следует немедленно свернуть военную активность против Йемена и сосредоточиться на реальной помощи простым людям, проживающим по всей территории этой страны. Господа председатель, не могу не напомнить о первопричинах сложившейся ситуации. Жестокой военной операции Израиля в секторе Газа, спровоцировавшие цепную реакцию по всему ближневосточному региону, в том числе и действия движения Ансар-Аллах. Немедленное прекращение огня в секторе окажет стабилизирующий эффект на ситуацию в Красном море. А деэскалация в этой акватории, в свою очередь, разблокирует усилия спецпосланника Грюнберга, вынужденного в нынешних условиях вернуться к челночной дипломатии вместо завершения работы над дорожной картой внутриеменского регулирования. Наша поддержка вашим усилиям, Ханс, неизменна. Мы понимаем, в каком непростом положении ООНовское посредничество оказалось из-за недальновидных действий наших друзей Запада, в первую очередь США и Великобритании. Ведь фактически каждый новый их удар по территории Йемена ведет к следующему витку эскалации и отдаляет перспективы нормализации. Россия, которая искренне стремится помочь йеменцам прийти к согласию, на фоне агрессивных действий Вашингтона и его сателлитов интенсифицировала собственные посреднические усилия. Продолжаем в контактах со всеми ведущими йеменскими политсилами и ключевыми региональными партнерами акцентировать необходимость скорейшего выхода на долгосрочную стабилизацию ситуации в рамках инклюзивного межйеменского диалога под эгидой ООН. Призываем партнеров сохранять нацеленность на мирный процесс. Убеждены, что все йеменские игроки, включая руководство Ансар-Аллах, в конечном итоге настроены на продолжение диалога. Но им надо не только помогать, но и не мешать и не создавать дополнительные проблемы для йеменского урегулирования своими непродуманными действиями. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Wasorno for their comprehensive briefings and also for your tireless efforts. Cognizant of mounting tensions in the region, it is of utmost importance that parties to the conflict in Yemen remain dedicated to finding a political agreement that will lead to a sustainable peace. The establishment of a UN roadmap will be crucial to ensure the fulfillment of commitments made by parties in December. More specifically, these include the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire, improving living conditions, and engaging in preparations for the resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process under UN auspices. The humanitarian emergency in Yemen remains a critical concern for Malta. This must remain a priority for this Council. 9 years into this conflict, a staggering 18 million people need humanitarian assistance and protection services. We welcome the appointment of Julian Arnett as the UN Resident Coordinator in Yemen and thank his predecessor David Gressly for his dedicated service. The UN's Humanitarian Response Plan for 2024 is a lifeline for millions of Yemenis. We call on donors to support the UN in their efforts to deliver essential humanitarian aid. The food insecurity situation is equally worrying. Over 12 million people lack sufficient access to safe drinking water, resulting in an alarming increase in cholera and other infectious diseases. Chronic access impediments faced by humanitarian workers exacerbate the suffering for Yemeni civilians. We remind all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law. Restrictions to freedom of movement for women aid workers limit access to basic services among Yemen's most vulnerable. In this regard, we reiterate our call on the Houthis to lift the Mahram requirements with immediate effect. Madam President, nearly 2.5 million children are out of school. A further 8 million are at risk of leaving the education system due to the destruction and repurposing of school buildings and internal displacement. All parties must refrain from actions that impede access to education. They have the responsibility to safeguard, protect, respect, and promote the right to education in line with Resolution 2601. As we have heard today, Yemen is not only experiencing one of the world's worst humanitarian and development crises, it is also among the countries most vulnerable to climate change. This has been underscored by the damage and disruption caused by recent natural disasters, including excessive flooding. Malta reiterates its call for synergies to be met with concrete solutions, with a focus on strengthening early warning, anticipatory actions, and climate-resilient agriculture and food systems. Malta is also deeply concerned by the impact of recent escalations in the region and their implication for Yemen's roadmap to peace and the humanitarian situation. As recognized in Resolution 2722, the Houthis must immediately cease all attacks on commercial shipping. They must also release any personnel or vessels that are being detained. Furthermore, we reiterate that all member states defending their vessels must do so in accordance with international law. Malta calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize diplomatic channels so as not to further escalate the current situation. In conclusion, Madam President, the international community must safeguard the hard-won gains made towards peace in Yemen. We call on all parties to remain dedicated to agreeing to a UN roadmap for a formalized ceasefire and political process, and to guarantee the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. We must continue to support the people of Yemen and ensure that, after nearly a decade of conflict, their path to peace is protected. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Worsonu, for your briefings today. Let me also welcome Yemen's representative to this meeting. The United States also welcomes the Secretary General's report published last week on Houthi threats to maritime security. This reporting on Houthi attacks on merchant and commercial vessels in the Red Sea, as requested by Resolution 2722, makes clear the extent of this threat and the need for this Council to continue to demand that the Houthis cease their attacks. In response to attacks on U.S. naval vessels, the United States has taken necessary and proportionate measures in the exercise of its inherent right of self-defense, as described in letters provided to the Council on January 12, January 26, and February 6. As we indicated in our letters, these strikes, taken in self-defense, aim to disrupt and degrade the Houthis' ability to continue their reckless attacks against vessels and commercial shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden. It also bears repeating that the United States does not desire more conflict in the region. We call again on the Houthis to release the crew of the MV Galaxy Leader. It has been nearly 3 months since the Houthis took the 25-member crew and their ship hostage, and every day that their detention continues is unacceptable. Madam President, Iran cannot deny its role in enabling and supporting the attacks carried out by the Houthis, given Iran's long-term material support for and encouragement of the Houthis' destabilizing actions in the region. Since 2014, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has provided the Houthis a growing arsenal of advanced weapons that they have used to attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea. The provision of this materiel violates UN Security Council resolutions 2140 and 2216. Between 2015 and 2023, the United States and its partners have interdicted at least 18 vessels illicitly smuggling weapons to the Houthis, seizing ballistic, cruise, and anti-ship missile components, UAVs, and other weapons. And just weeks ago, on January 11, while conducting a flag verification boarding, U.S. Navy forces interdicted a vessel illegally transporting advanced lethal aid, including advanced Iranian-manufactured ballistic and cruise missile components, from Iran to resupply Houthi militants in Yemen. We call again on every member state, and especially those with direct channels to Iran, to press Iran's leaders to rein in the Houthis and stop these lawless attacks and abide by their obligations under Security Council resolutions. The Houthis are trying to apply a chokehold on global shipping through the Red Sea. As a result, people around the world face increased costs for goods and supplies. Rerouting a ship around Africa adds roughly 10 days and $1 million in fuel costs for each one-way voyage between Asia and Europe. The Houthis also continued to lay siege to cities in Yemen and prevent the transfer of food, water, and humanitarian aid to civilian populations, laying bare the hypocrisy of their claims. Last month, the United States announced the designation of Ansar Allah, commonly known as the Houthis, as a specially designated global terrorist effective February 16. As the world's leading donor of humanitarian assistance for Yemen, we delayed the designation's effective date to consult with stakeholders on minimizing the impact these actions might have on the humanitarian situation. In addition to existing humanitarian carve-outs that mitigate the humanitarian impact on the Yemeni people, the United States also announced new general licenses to support continued access to essential goods and services in Yemen. The United States seeks to narrowly target the Houthis' terrorist activities while mitigating any humanitarian harm on the people of Yemen who deserve the chance for a better future. To that end, we congratulate His Excellency Ahmed bin Mubarak on his appointment as Yemen's Prime Minister and thank outgoing Prime Minister Abdul Malik for his service to the Yemeni people. We commend both for their sustained commitment to a UN-led Yemeni political process aimed at bringing the Yemen conflict to an end. It is important that any intra-Yemeni peace framework support not only dialogue between the Houthis and the government, but it include broad engagement with Yemeni civil society and other stakeholders. Their calls for justice, accountability, and redress for human rights abuses and violations must not only be heard, but also addressed. For this reason, we continue to call for the release of our own locally employed staff who have been detained by the Houthis in Sana'a for more than 2 years, and all others unjustly detained in Yemen. Above all, the United States remains committed to achieving lasting peace, stability, and prosperity for the Yemeni people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Et je remercie nos deux intervenantes et intervenants de leurs exposés et de leurs efforts inlassables, y inclut les visites récentes de l'envoyé spécial en faveur de la paix et de la protection des civils au Yémen. Et je souhaite aussi la bienvenue aux représentants du Yémen ici au Conseil. Nous l'avons entendu, en ce début d'année, le Yémen se trouve une nouvelle fois à la croisée des chemins. Si l'espoir d'un règlement pacifique demeure, la récente dynamique régionale a conduit à des risques supplémentaires. Nous le savons toutes et tous, une désescalade régionale aurait un effet positif pour le Yémen et, de la même manière, une paix durable au Yémen provoquerait un effet stabilisateur dans la région, y compris pour la sécurité en mer Rouge. C'est pourquoi il est essentiel de préserver les acquis des discussions en cours. Les parties doivent s'engager pleinement en faveur d'un processus inclusif sous l'égide des Nations unies. À cet égard, sans un engagement soutenu de tous les acteurs, y compris la participation significative des femmes, les actrices, les propositions de paix manqueront de perspectives et ne seront pas à même d'assurer une sécurité durable dans le pays. Comme l'a affirmé Yasmine Al-Eriani du Sana Center en mai dernier, devant ce Conseil, je cite, « Les femmes, les jeunes et tous les segments de la société yéménite sont tout à fait capables de reconstruire le pays et de façonner son avenir. » En outre, la Suisse appelle toutes les parties à la prudence et à la retenue, tout comme au strict respect du droit international et à redoubler d'efforts diplomatiques à cette fin. Une nouvelle dégradation de la situation aura des conséquences humaines et économiques dévastatrices. Nous en sommes les témoins. Cette dernière décennie de guerre a fortement impacté de nombreux secteurs de la société yéménite et notamment l'éducation. La société civile yéménite nous le dit clairement. Désormais, des millions d'enfants portent des fusils à la place de leurs cartables. Cette situation est inacceptable. C'est pourquoi nous appelons toutes les parties à mettre en œuvre leur plan d'action pour mettre fin et prévenir les violations graves à l'encontre des enfants. Madame la Présidente, concernant la situation humanitaire, la Suisse rappelle que les parties sont tenues, en vertu du droit international humanitaire, d'autoriser et de faciliter un acheminement rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire. À cet égard, et nous le soulignons régulièrement, le personnel humanitaire est protégé par le DIH et doit pouvoir être en mesure de travailler indépendamment de toute question de nationalité. La Suisse salue l'engagement de ces femmes et de ces hommes qui travaillent dans l'un des environnements les plus difficiles au monde. Leur engagement permet d'apporter une aide vitale à des millions de personnes. La directrice des opérations et du plaidoyer d'OCHA l'a souligné. Cette aide est essentielle, notamment au vu du niveau d'insécurité alimentaire particulièrement alarmant au Yémen. La population yéménite est prise dans des crises successives et cumulatives, le changement climatique étant l'une des plus graves. Combiné au conflit, l'augmentation des catastrophes naturelles pousse les personnes à se déplacer, exacerbant ainsi la crise humanitaire en cours. C'est pourquoi il faut non seulement intensifier l'aide humanitaire, mais aussi renforcer les systèmes d'alerte précoce. Enfin, le manque structurel des ressources en eau doit être contré. Cela passe notamment par des mesures politiques sensibles aux défis liés à l'eau afin de prévenir de futurs conflits liés à cette problématique. Madame la Présidente, ce Conseil et les pays de la région doivent redoubler d'efforts pour contribuer à un environnement propice aux discussions de paix et répondre aux besoins humanitaires croissants. La Suisse souhaite, dans ce contexte, réaffirmer son plein soutien à l'envoyé spécial Hans Grunberg. La population yéménite ne peut plus attendre. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And thank you also to our briefers today, to Special Envoy Grunberg and to Director Vosornu. I also congratulate Mr. Julian Harnis on his appointment as a regional coordinator. And as this is our first briefing on Yemen, I wish to extend Slovenia's full support for the work of your respective offices. I also want to welcome representative of Yemen to today's meeting. Madam President, I will begin today by addressing the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, one of the world's worst. This has been brought into sharp focus by the Humanitarian Needs Overview and Response Plan for 2024, published earlier this month. And as Director Vosornu have just informed us, Yemen remains one of the most food insecure countries, following years of conflict, displacement, and increasing effects of climate change, leading to droughts and flooding. The impact of the country's water scarcity on access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation is alarming. And we are horrified that Yemeni children in particular are at daily risk of casualty from the landmines and other unexploded ordnance. All of this is compounded by a challenging humanitarian funding situation and precarious security environment for aid workers on the ground. I start by raising the issue today as, amidst broader regional conflagration, the suffering of the Yemeni people through 9 long years of war should not be overlooked or forgotten. The Yemeni people must remain our primary incentive for finding a solution to this protracted conflict. And for some time, this solution had appeared within reach. We welcomed the encouraging update from the Special Envoy as announced in December, that the parties had made a commitment to reaching a ceasefire and developing a UN roadmap. It is disappointing, but not unexpected, that the deterioration situation across the region is affecting peace process in Yemen at the moment. We fully back continuing UN efforts towards translating the truce into a nationwide ceasefire respected by all parties. We recognize the need for inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue and political settlement. And we stress the importance of underrepresented groups such as women and youth having a meaningful voice in this process. Slovenia welcomes your efforts, Special Envoy, to continue to engage with all stakeholders, now needed more than ever. And we encourage those with influence over the parties to use it wisely and to foster constructive dialogue. Madam President, last month we adopted Resolution 2722 condemning Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which have regrettably continued. And I reiterate Slovenia's call for these attacks to cease. To conclude, Madam President, we urge the long overdue peace for the people of Yemen remain a top priority for all. We call for the Security Council to stay united in this endeavor, and we emphasize the need to prioritize diplomatic efforts first and foremost. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradezco la información proporcionada por el enviado especial, señor Hans Grunberg, así como a la directora de Operaciones y Promoción de la OCHA, señora Edem Vosornu, También doy la bienvenida al representante de Yemen en esta reunión. Reitero el reconocimiento a la labor del enviado especial Grunberg para impulsar el proceso de diálogo basado en el compromiso con la democracia, la buena gobernanza y la reconciliación nacional en Yemen. Y lo aliento a continuar con sus esfuerzos. Aprovecho para desearle éxito en el cumplimiento de sus funciones al nuevo coordinador residente y humanitario de las Naciones Unidas en Yemen, señor Julian Arneis. Señora Presidenta, a mi delegación le preocupa el impacto que la escalada de violencia en el Mar Rojo, provocada por los ataques hutíes en contra de las embarcaciones comerciales, puede tener en la concreción de una hoja de ruta para las negociaciones. Y consideramos que el diálogo político intra-yemení, bajo los auspicios de las Naciones Unidas, es el único camino viable hacia la paz sostenible en Yemen. El Ecuador reitera la necesidad de cumplir con la resolución 2722 y hace un llamado a los hutíes a que cesen sus actividades a las embarcaciones comerciales y liberen a todos los tripulantes que han sido retenidos. Luego de casi 9 años de guerra, más de la mitad de la población de Yemen, esto es, 18.2 millones de personas, requieren asistencia humanitaria, cuya atención, de acuerdo con el Plan de Respuesta Humanitaria 2024 de la OCHA, demanda un presupuesto de 2.700 millones de dólares. Hoy más que nunca, la población yemení requiere el aporte de la comunidad internacional. Una mayor escalada del conflicto anularía la leve mejoría que la situación humanitaria en Yemen experimentó durante el año 2023 como resultado de la tregua. Los ataques producidos a las embarcaciones comerciales en el Mar Rojo han ocasionado un incremento de los precios de transportes y retrasos en los envíos de bienes esenciales como combustibles y alimentos. Esta situación para Yemen propone un escenario con proyecciones que demuestran que la población experimentará niveles de inseguridad alimentaria aguda en áreas controladas por el gobierno de Yemen, incrementando del 41 al 45%, equivalente a 4,56 millones de personas. Por otra parte, las organizaciones humanitarias podrían verse obligadas a detener sus operaciones en áreas donde se han registrado hostilidades, afectando a poblaciones vulnerables que requieren de su asistencia. Mi país reitera el llamado del secretario general y del enviado especial para que las partes se abstengan de acciones que podrían resultar en un nuevo conflicto armado, el cual, a más de socavar el frágil proceso de paz y los limitados avances humanitarios, podría exacerbar también las tensiones regionales. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by expressing our appreciation to Special Envoy Mr. Grunberg and OCHA Director Ms. Wasonu for their informative briefings. My appreciation also goes to the Secretariat and the International Maritime Organization for their preparation for the report in accordance with Resolution 2722. Today, I would like to focus on 3 issues: the ongoing crisis in the Red Sea, the peace process, and the humanitarian situation in Yemen. Madam President, we have been witnessing an extraordinary number of reports of the Houthis launching or attempting to launch missiles, drones, and other advanced weapons toward vessels in the Red Sea and its vicinity. The Houthis' continued threats to maritime security and navigational rights have led to a sharp decrease in trade via the Suez Canal, as the Secretary General recently informed the General Assembly. Now, many commercial ships are forced to take the more costly, energy-intensive, and time-consuming route around South Africa for their travel between Asia and Europe. Businesses around the world, including my country, have already experienced a negative real-life impact due to this disruption of global supply chains. I have voiced grave concern about this problem several times in this chamber,
and the Security Council has unequivocally pronounced the same in Resolution 2722. But Japan once again condemns the Houthis' attacks and demands their immediate cessation. Likewise, we condemn the seizure of the Japanese-operated Galaxy Leader and demand the immediate release of the vessel and its 25 crew members, which the Houthis have been illegally holding for nearly 3 months. Madam President, moving to the Yemen's peace process, Japan commends the mediation efforts of the Special Envoy, and as well as the critical role played by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Sultanate of Oman, despite the current very difficult circumstances. Japan believes the political stability is essential for Yemen, as it will not only enhance the country's national security, but will also lay the foundation for improving the economic and humanitarian situation. We will continue to support the work of the Special Envoy and trust the UN roadmap he and his team are preparing will bring lasting peace in Yemen. Madam President, the people of Yemen have been suffering from a devastating humanitarian situation over 9 years of conflict. Japan is seriously concerned that delays as well as increased costs of imports due to the growing security risk in the Red Sea will only worsen their plight. Japan is also deeply concerned about the severe malnutrition and food shortages seen across the country. We sincerely hope that WFP can resume its vital operations as soon as possible. Given the current significant shortfall in humanitarian funding, Japan has recently decided to make an additional contribution of more than $18 million to Yemen in our most recent supplementary budget. This includes contribution of approximately $2 million to WFP to increase their ability to provide emergency food assistance to the most vulnerable people in Yemen. Japan remains committed to improving the humanitarian situation in Yemen. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Algeria, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and my country, Guyana. I want to welcome and thank UN Special Envoy, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and OCHA Director of Operations and Advocacy, Ms. Edem Wosernou, for their valuable briefings. We also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen in this meeting. At the outset, the A3+ wishes to reiterate its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen. The A3+ recognizes the positive engagement and commitment of the government of Yemen to the international and regional efforts to end the conflict and resume the political process under the auspices of the UN. The situation in Yemen requires collective effort to consolidate the commitment and support from the United Nations system and regional actors in the pursuit of a comprehensive and lasting peace. In this vein, we welcome the appointment of Ms. Julian Harness as the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Yemen and the new humanitarian coordinator in the country. The people of Yemen deserve peace, security, and stability in advancing their political and economic future. The facilitating role of the UN Special Envoy and the efforts made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman, aiming to facilitate the resumption of an intra-Yemeni political process under the auspices of the United Nations, is vital to ensure an inclusive political process in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. We therefore welcome and express our full support for his ongoing consultations with all relevant parties and stakeholders as part of the framework for a comprehensive peace process. The A3+ wishes to stress the importance of preserving the recent commitments announced by the parties in December 2023 and the ongoing discussions around a UN roadmap that would operationalize a nationwide ceasefire, resume an inclusive political process under UN auspices, and address key priorities for the benefit of the Yemeni people. Further, we stress the importance for the parties to provide the space for the full, effective, and meaningful participation of Yemeni women and civil society in all stages of the peace process, noting their long demonstrated willingness and capacity to engage in national efforts at all levels to resolve the conflict. The A3 Plus call upon the Houthis to adhere to the peace process in the country and sustain the goal of maintaining a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire in the country. Maintaining a comprehensive ceasefire built on the truce of April 2022 would stimulate and bring sanity to the peace process itself and other relevant layers complementary to the peace process. In this vein, we urge the Houthis to cease hostilities and to refrain from threatening commercial vessels and endangering international navigation and innocent lives. After 9 years of conflict, the humanitarian needs in Yemen remain immense. A political agreement leading to sustainable peace is the only long-term solution to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The A3 Plus expresses its deepest concern over this worsening humanitarian situation in the country, seriously affecting women and children. The conflict has impacted humanitarian relief and destroyed critical civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, and health clinics, while inflicting death on many. We call on the responsible parties to remove the barriers affecting humanitarian aid flows and the ability of humanitarian workers to perform their duties. We note that 18.2 million Yemeni people will need humanitarian assistance and protection services in 2024, with 17.6 million facing food and nutrition insecurity. In this vein, we would welcome the resumption of food supplies to the country by the World Food Programme and call on all the parties concerned to support WFP in this endeavor. The A3 Plus stresses that the parties have a legal obligation to ensure that humanitarian personnel are allowed to carry out their work unhindered and free from harm. Hostage taking and other threats to their existence and ability to effectively carry out their duties, including by denying their freedom of movement, must cease. We strongly call for the release of all humanitarian workers and for an immediate end to all forms of intimidation employed to discourage them from carrying out their vital work. The crisis in Yemen has raged on for too long, tearing apart the fabric of the nation. On one side, forces loyal to the internationally recognized government fight to maintain order, while on the other, Houthi challenge this authority, controlling significant swaths of territory, including the capital, Sana'a. This relentless conflict has left behind a trail of destruction, displacement, and despair. We wish to spotlight the urgent need for funding in support of the humanitarian operations. It is concerning to us that the humanitarian funding portfolio has yet to achieve its desired target. We therefore call on international partners and donors to make meaningful contributions to the fund. The support from member states will sustain the lives of millions of Yemenis who are in need. Funding must also go beyond humanitarian assistance to include the development programs in Yemen. Together, we can continue to support the resilient people of Yemen and take decisive steps towards resolving what remains one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The continued deterioration and downward trend of the situation in Yemen, including the humanitarian crisis, the staggering economic conditions, together with the actions perpetrated by the Houthis, must be addressed. We urge the Houthis to refrain from using arbitrary measures that could exacerbate the suffering of the population. The A3 Plus expressed concern over the growing escalation of the use of force in the region in a situation that is already volatile. The continued attacks on Yemeni soil will affect humanitarian aid and further worsen the security situation in the country. The spate of airstrikes risk endangering the peace talks and the renewed commitment made by the parties.
اليمن وتخفيف المعاناة الإنسانية للشعب اليمني. وفي المقابل تواجه هذه الجهود بالرفض والتعنت من قبل الميليشيات الحوثية والتصعيد العسكري في مختلف الجبهات في ظل وجود هدنة هشة لم تلتزم هذه الميليشيات بتنفيذ بنودها، بما في ذلك استمرارها فرض الحصار الجائر على مدينة تعز وعدم الامتثال لالتزاماتها بفتح الطرق، مما تسبب في شتى إشكال المعاناة والأزمات لأكثر من 3 مليون نسمة يقطنون في هذه المدينة. ويمثل ذلك الحصار سياسة عقاب جماعي وجريمة حرب مكتملة الأركان، وفي تحد صارخ لدعوات المجتمع الدولي وهذا المجلس الموقر لوقف هذه الحرب واستئناف المسار السياسي لإنهاء الصراع. السيد الرئيس، إن ما تقوم به الميليشيات الحوثية من تصعيد في البحر الأحمر ليس بجديد، فقد حذر فخامة الرئيس الدكتور رشاد محمد العليمي رئيس مجلس القيادة الرئاسي أمام دورات الجمعية العامة وفي وقت مبكر، وكذلك تحذيرات الحكومة اليمنية وفي أكثر من مناسبة من خطورة استمرار سيطرة هذه الميليشيات المدعومة إيرانيا على الموانئ المطلة على البحر الأحمر وتهديداتها لطرق الملاحة الدولية، بالإضافة إلى التحذيرات المتكررة الواردة في تقارير فريق الخبراء المعني باليمن التابع للجنة العقوبات عن الهجمات الحوثية في البحر الأحمر. وهناك العشرات من الأدلة والإثباتات عن تلك الهجمات والاعتداءات الحوثية، ولكن للأسف لم تلقى هذه التحذيرات الاهتمام من قبل المجتمع الدولي، وهو ما نشهده اليوم من تصعيد. كما نحذر من استمرار تدفق الأسلحة الإيرانية إلى الميليشيات الحوثية ومخاطرها على السلم والأمن الإقليمي والدولي وإطالة أمد الصراع في اليمن ومفاقمة الأزمة الإنسانية. نؤكد على الحق السيادي للحكومة اليمنية في حماية مياهها الإقليمية وتعزيز الأمن والاستقرار في البحر الأحمر ومضيق باب المندب والمنطقة، ولن يتأتى ذلك إلا بتقديم الدعم للحكومة اليمنية وبناء قدراتها لتأمين حركة التجارة العالمية وتمكينها من استعادة مؤسسات الدولة وبسط سيادتها وممارسة سلطاتها على كامل التراب اليمني، بما في ذلك المدن والموانئ التي تحولت إلى منصات لتهديد أمن وسلامة الملاحة الدولية. وتحمل الحكومة اليمنية للميليشيات الحوثية مسؤولية جر اليمن إلى ساحة صراع دولي لإغراض دعائية وادعاءات مضللة ليس لها علاقة بنصرة القضية الفلسطينية العادلة، فإنها تعيد التذكير بأن بعض سياسات المجتمع الدولي تجاه التعامل مع الأزمة اليمنية قد ساهمت في بقاء وتعزيز سيطرة هذه الميليشيات وتشجيعها على الاستمرار في ارتكاب المزيد من الأعمال العدائية التي تمثل تهديداً للأمن والاستقرار الإقليمي والدولي. وندعو المجتمع الدولي مجدداً إلى خلق مقاربة واقعية وضرورة تصحيح السرديات المغلوطة والنهج المتبع في التعاطي مع الوضع في اليمن وإدراك خلفياته. السيد الرئيس، ترحب الحكومة اليمنية بالقرار الذي اتخذته الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الصديقة بشأن تصنيف الميليشيات الحوثية جماعة إرهابية عالمية، وندعو إلى الاستجابة لمتطلبات تصنيف هذه الميليشيات منظمة إرهابية لوقف انتهاكاتها وجرائمها بحق اليمنيين وإعادة النظر في سلوكها الإرهابي ونبذ العنف والقبول بالحلول السياسية لإحلال السلام في اليمن والكف عن تهديد أمن واستقرار اليمن والمنطقة. أن التصعيد الأخير في البحر الأحمر سيترتب عليه تداعيات اقتصادية وإنسانية وخيمة، بما في ذلك زيادة الأعباء الاقتصادية والإنسانية والإضرار بالسيادة الوطنية ومصالح الشعب اليمني، وسيؤدي ارتفاع تكاليف الشحن البحري والتأمين على ارتفاع السلع والمواد الغذائية في بلد يعاني من أسوأ أزمة إنسانية، حيث أن 80% من احتياجات المناطق الخاضعة لسيطرة الميليشيات الحوثية تعتمد وبشكل رئيسي على استيراد المواد الغذائية والسلع عبر ميناء الحديدة على البحر الأحمر. ونحذر من أن استمرار هذه الهجمات قد يسبب الإغلاق شبه الكامل لحركة التجارة العالمية في البحر الأحمر ومضيق باب المندب، مما يؤدي إلى توقف عمليات الاستيراد والتصدير وتأثير ذلك على الوضع الاقتصادي والإنساني المتفاقم وحياة اليمنيين ومعيشتهم. السيد الرئيس، تعمل الحكومة اليمنية على تنفيذ جملة من الإصلاحات الاقتصادية والمالية، وبدعم من الأشقاء والأصدقاء وشركاء اليمن في التنمية لتعزيز مسار هذه الإصلاحات والإسهام في تحسين الأوضاع الاقتصادية واحتواء التداعيات الإنسانية والاقتصادية الناجمة عن تصعيد الميليشيات الحوثية واستهدافها للمنشآت النفطية الحيوية. وأكرر هنا أمام هذا المجلس الموقر استهدافها للمنشآت النفطية الحيوية ومنع الحكومة اليمنية من تصدير النفط. أن حرمان الحكومة اليمنية من إعادة تصدير النفط لأكثر من عام ونصف بسبب هجمات الميليشيات الحوثية، وبالتالي حرمان الشعب اليمني من أهم موارده وأثر ذلك على الموازنة العامة للدولة، وعجز الحكومة عن توفير الخدمات الأساسية للمواطنين بما في ذلك دفع المرتبات، وحرمان الاقتصاد الوطني من تدفق العملة الصعبة وزيادة الضغط على سعر صرف العملة الوطنية، وما يسببه من تداعيات اقتصادية وإنسانية كارثية. إنما يمثل سياسة تجويع وحرب اقتصادية ممنهجة تشنها هذه الميليشيات ضد الشعب اليمني، ولا يمكن السكوت عليها طويلا. وتدعو الحكومة اليمنية المجتمع الدولي مساعدتها في إيجاد طرق ووسائل ممكنة لإعادة تصدير النفط، هذا المورد الحيوي الهام، للوفاء بالتزاماتها وواجباتها. وتجدد الحكومة اليمنية مطالبتها المنظمات الإنسانية بما في ذلك وكالات الأمم المتحدة بتحويل أموالها المقدمة لليمن عبر البنك المركزي اليمني في العاصمة المؤقتة عدن للمساهمة في استقرار العملة الوطنية ودعم الاقتصاد وتعزيز المخزون الغذائي. ونشيد هنا بالدعم الاقتصادي والمالي الأخوي المستمر من الأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، الهادف إلى دعم جهود الحكومة اليمنية في تنفيذ خططها ومواجهة التحديات الاقتصادية القائمة، فضلا عن تدخلاتهما الإنسانية. عدد من بشكل كبير في التخفيف من المعاناة الإنسانية. ونعبر عن عظيم التقدير للأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية بتحويل الدفعة الثانية بمبلغ 250 مليون دولار لدعم الموازنة العامة للدولة وإسناد جهود الحكومة للوفاء بالتزاماتها. السيد الرئيس، تعبر الحكومة اليمنية عن دعمها وتضامنها الكامل مع مجتمع العمل الإنساني ضد الإجراءات التعسفية التي اتخذتها الميليشيات الحوثية المتمثلة في طرد موظفي الأمم المتحدة ووكالات الإغاثة الإنسانية من حاملي الجنسية البريطانية والأمريكية. هذه الإجراءات اللا أخلاقية تضاف إلى سجل هذه الميليشيات الحافل بالانتهاكات الجسيمة لحرية العمل الإنساني. ويؤكد مجلس القيادة الرئاسي والحكومة اليمنية على تقديم كافة التسهيلات والضمانات لعمل المنظمات الدولية ووكالات الإغاثة الإنسانية العاملة في العاصمة المؤقتة عدن، بما يعزز حضورها وتدخلاتها الإنسانية في مختلف المحافظات اليمنية دون قيود. السيد الرئيس، أن التصعيد في البحر الأحمر والعمليات الإرهابية الذي دفع الأمم المتحدة وبرنامجها الإنمائي إلى تعليق كافة الأعمال المرتبطة بتنفيذ خطة الأمم المتحدة لإنقاذ الناقلة الصافر على أن تستأنف هذه العملية فور استقرار الأوضاع الأمنية في البحر الأحمر، يدق جرس الخطر والإنذار حول وضع ناقلة النفط الصافر. فعلى الرغم من النجاحات والتقدم المحرز في تنفيذ المرحلة الأولى من هذه الخطة ونقل أكثر من 1,140,000 برميل من النفط الخام للناقلة البديلة، إلا أن هناك مخاوف كبيرة من بقاء هذه الكمية الهائلة من النفط في منطقة شديدة الخطورة تسيطر عليها ميليشيات منفلتة. هذه الاعتداءات قد خلقت تحديات مالية وتشغيلية في تنفيذ عملية الإنقاذ وتجنب الكارثة. السيد الرئيس، يؤكد مجلس القيادة الرئاسي عن موقفه الثابت في دعم نضالات الشعب الفلسطيني وقضيته العادلة وإدانته وبأشد العبارات العدوان الإسرائيلي الغاشم على قطاع غزة والضفة الغربية المحتلة، وندعو مجددا إلى الوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار في قطاع غزة لضمان حماية المدنيين وإنقاذ المزيد من الأرواح بما في ذلك النساء والأطفال الذين يعانون الجحيم يوميا على أرض غزة، ودخول المساعدات الإنسانية وبشكل مستدام ودون عوائق، وحماية الشعب الفلسطيني من هذا العدوان الإجرامي. كما نعبر عن رفضنا القاطع للتهجير القسري للفلسطينيين من أرضهم، ونعبر عن إدانتنا الشديدة واستنكارنا للتصريحات التي أدلى بها رئيس حكومة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بشأن خطط مواصلة العدوان الإسرائيلي واقتحام مدينة رفح جنوب قطاع غزة، والذي يهدف إلى الإمعان في مزيد من القتل بحق الشعب الفلسطيني وتهجيره قسرا وارتكاب جرائم الإبادة الجماعية والتطهير العرقي ودفع مئات الآلاف للنزوح من القطاع في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني، وما يمثله ذلك من إشعال خطير للوضع في المنطقة وتداعيات كارثية على الأمن والاستقرار. وندعو مجلس الأمن إلى القيام بواجبه وتحمل مسؤولياته لوقف هذا العدوان وهذه الجرائم بحق الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل، معظمهم من النساء والأطفال، والتي ترتكب يوميا في ظل صمت مريب. وإذا لم يتحرك المجتمع الدولي وهذا المجلس الموقر الآن في ظل هذه الجرائم الوحشية التي ترتكبها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، فمتى يمكن أن يتحرك وينتصر لمبادئه ووقفه ويحافظ على مصداقيته؟ ونؤكد مجددا بأن السلام العادل والشامل في المنطقة لن يتحقق حتى نيل الشعب الفلسطيني لحقوقه غير القابلة للتصرف وإقامة دولته الفلسطينية المستقلة ذات السيادة على حدود 4 حزيران 67 وعاصمة القدس الشرقية وفق القرارات الشرعية الدولية ومبادرة السلام العربية والاعتراف بالدولة الفلسطينية. ودون هذا الحل لن تنعم المنطقة بالسلام والاستقرار. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Yemen for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.